Racist gang attacks Amish woman, unaware she's a Navy SEAL. The sun was setting over the quiet town of Westbrook, casting an orange glow across the streets as Claire, an Amish woman, walked down the sidewalk. She had always felt the weight of people's stares, the whispers behind her back. But today something felt different. A low rumble of an engine sounded behind her, growing louder as the black van came closer. The vehicle screeched to a halt, blocking her path. 4 men stepped out, their eyes filled with malice. "Look at this freak," one of them sneered, pointing at her plain dress and bonnet. "Must be lost in the wrong neighborhood," another man chuckled. Claire stood her ground, but her heart raced. These men didn't know who they were dealing with. Suddenly, one of the men lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm. Claire reacted instantly, spinning around and throwing a punch that landed squarely on the man's jaw. He staggered back in shock. The other men hesitated, not expecting resistance. But they quickly regrouped, circling her. "You think you can fight us?" one of them taunted, pulling out a knife. Claire's eyes narrowed. They didn't know what they had just started. The fight was about to escalate in a way they could never have imagined. She quickly assessed the situation, the adrenaline rushing through her veins. Just then, a swift kick to the chest knocked one of the men to the ground. Another was thrown into the van. The remaining 2 froze in confusion as Claire moved with military precision, her Navy SEAL training kicking in. They didn't know what hit them. One of the men fumbled for his phone, trying to call for backup, but Claire was faster. She disarmed him with a quick twist of his wrist, sending the phone flying across the street. The remaining man stared at her, his face pale, realizing too late that the Amish woman he had just attacked wasn't who she seemed. But just as Claire prepared to finish what she had started, the sound of sirens echoed down the street. The gang members bolted, leaving Claire standing alone. She exhaled sharply, looking at the destruction around her. For a moment, everything was still and she wondered what would happen next. Earlier that day, Claire had woken up like any other morning, tending to her chores on her family's farm. The smell of fresh bread filled the air as she prepared breakfast. The Amish lifestyle was simple, quiet, and peaceful, exactly how she liked it. But what most people didn't know was that she had another life, one she had left behind when she chose to join her community. Before becoming Amish, Claire had been part of the Navy SEALs, a special forces division in the military. She had served overseas, gone through hell, and made her country proud. But her decision to leave the Navy and adopt the Amish way of life had not been easy. There were times when her old instincts kicked in, and she had to remind herself that she wasn't in that world anymore. It was a choice she made to escape violence and to live in peace. But the past had a way of catching up with her. It was moments like these when the demons of her former life resurfaced. Claire had heard the whispers about a local gang causing trouble in Westbrook. They were known for their racist attacks and violent behavior, terrorizing anyone who didn't fit their idea of normal. Claire tried to avoid them, but they had found her today. And they had no idea who they were messing with. She took a deep breath, standing at the side of the road. The sirens grew louder and soon a police car pulled up, followed by a couple of patrolmen. They got out, surveying the scene. "Are you okay, ma'am?" one of the officers asked, walking toward Claire. Claire nodded, her face calm and composed. "I'm fine." But inside she knew the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. She couldn't forget what happened today. She couldn't forget what those men had tried to do. As she walked toward the officers, Claire knew she had to make a decision. Should she go to the authorities and tell them the truth, revealing her secret life? Or should she let them believe she was just an innocent Amish woman, leaving her past behind? The thought of exposing herself terrified her. She had worked hard to distance herself from that world. But now, with these men knowing a part of her secret, she wasn't sure she could hide it any longer. The officer's voice broke through her thoughts. "We'll take care of them. You're safe now." But was she? She glanced over her shoulder, watching the police arrest the gang members. What if they came back? What if there were more of them out there? And what would she do if they did? She couldn't run anymore. As the officers took the gang members away, Claire felt her heart pounding again. What did this mean for her? The next few days were a blur for Claire. News of the attack spread quickly throughout Westbrook, but no one knew the full story. Claire kept to herself, choosing not to share the details of what had really happened. The town buzzed with rumors and people started to treat her differently. They didn't know how to react to the idea of an Amish woman fighting back against such violence. But Claire knew it was only a matter of time before someone started asking the right questions. Late one night, as Claire sat in her modest home, a knock came at the door. She froze, her instincts kicking in. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she was met by a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and his eyes were sharp, calculating. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Who was this man? And what did he want? Claire stared at the man standing at her door, his presence sending a chill down her spine. There was something about him, something off. His eyes were sharp, scanning her, almost as if he were trying to figure out her every move. For a brief moment, she thought about slamming the door in his face. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the look in his eyes. Maybe it was the way he held himself, confident, almost too confident. He didn't seem like someone who would be easily dismissed. "Can I help you?" Claire asked, her voice steady despite the nerves tightening in her stomach. The man studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her face as if he were trying to decide whether she was worth his time. Finally he spoke. "I need to talk to you, Claire," he said, his tone low, almost secretive. Claire's heart skipped a beat. How did he know her name? She didn't recognize him, and she certainly hadn't invited him over. She stepped back slightly, feeling the weight of the situation settling on her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharper now. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one else was around. Then he looked back at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I know what happened," he said quietly. "I know what you did." Claire's pulse quickened. The man wasn't just talking about the attack with the gang. He was talking about something deeper, something from her past. But how could he know? She had buried that part of her life, left it behind when she chose the Amish way. She had thought she was free from it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, trying to mask the panic that was rising inside her. The man raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "You can't hide from your past forever, Claire." Her stomach twisted. The walls she had built around herself felt like they were crumbling. What did this man want from her? And how did he know the things he did? She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I don't want any trouble. If you're here to cause it, you'd better leave." But the man didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer, lowering his voice so that only Claire could hear him. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Claire. I'm here to offer you a chance to take control of your life again. You're not the same woman you were when you left the Navy. I know that. But you can't run from who you are." Claire felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. He was right. She had spent years trying to forget her past, trying to live a life of peace. But now it seemed that peace was being threatened. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes glinted with something dark, something dangerous. "I'm offering you a way back into the life you once knew. A chance to come out of hiding. There are people out there who need someone like you. Someone with your skills." Claire shook her head, stepping back. "I don't want that life anymore. I left it all behind." But the man wasn't deterred. "You can't change who you are. You're a Navy SEAL, Claire. You're trained to fight. You're trained to survive. You can't pretend that's not a part of you." Claire clenched her fists, feeling a familiar anger rising within her. She had spent so long trying to suppress that part of herself. She didn't want to go back to a life of violence, a life filled with conflict and danger. She wanted peace. She wanted normalcy. But the man wasn't giving her that option. "I'm not asking you to come back, Claire," he said, his voice now colder. "I'm telling you, you don't have a choice. These men who attacked you, this is just the beginning. There are bigger threats coming. And you can't protect yourself or anyone else without embracing who you really are." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. She wanted to turn him away, to slam the door and pretend this conversation never happened. But deep down she knew he was right. Her past had found her, and there was no escaping it. She stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the man. For the first time in years she felt trapped. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the tension. Claire's eyes snapped to the side, and she saw two figures walking down the dirt path toward her house. They were tall, their bodies leaning forward as they moved with purpose. The man at her door turned and looked over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "You're not safe here anymore," he muttered under his breath. "You'll have to decide soon, Claire." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Claire stood there, her mind racing. Who were those men? And what did they want with her? Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the mysterious man walk away into the darkness. The footsteps that had caught her attention belonged to two other figures, now coming closer. Her breath quickened. Who were they? What did they want? Were they part of the gang? Or was there something more to all of this? She stepped back into her house and quietly closed the door, but she kept the lock off for now. Her instincts told her to stay alert. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but she wasn't about to let her guard down. Moments later, a soft knock echoed on the door. Claire's pulse raced as she stood frozen, unsure whether she should open it or not. She had a feeling it wasn't the police or anyone she knew. Another knock, this one more insistent. Claire took a deep breath and approached the door cautiously. She couldn't hide forever, and this time she needed to face whatever was coming her way. When she opened it, she was greeted by two men in suits. Their faces were stern, their postures rigid. They didn't look like typical visitors to a quiet Amish home. "Can we come in?" one of them asked, his voice smooth and cold. Claire hesitated for a moment, but the serious expression on their faces told her that this wasn't a casual visit. She stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The men didn't sit down, choosing instead to stand by the door. Claire felt a sense of unease in the air. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. The first man spoke again, this time with more authority in his voice. "We know what happened the other day. The gang members you defended yourself against, they were just pawns in a much larger game. And we need your help." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She had a sinking feeling that she was in way over her head. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The second man stepped forward, his gaze intense. "You're not just an Amish woman, are you? You're trained a Navy SEAL. We know what you're capable of." Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The man from earlier had warned her that her past would catch up with her, but this was more than she had expected. They knew too much. "You're right," Claire said, her voice firm despite the fear rising inside her. "I'm not just an Amish woman. But I've left that life behind. I want nothing to do with it anymore." The first man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, calculating. "That's where you're wrong. You don't get to leave. We need you, Claire." "What do you mean you need me?" Claire asked, her voice shaking slightly now. "We have a job for you," the second man said, his tone stern. "There's a group, more like a network, of people who have been targeting Amish communities like yours. They use intimidation, fear, and violence to get what they want. And they won't stop until they have everything. We believe you're the only one who can stop them." Claire's mind raced as she tried to process everything they were saying. These men weren't just concerned about the gang that had attacked her. There was something much bigger going on. "I'm not a part of that world anymore," Claire repeated, more firmly this time. "I don't want any part of whatever this is." The first man didn't seem deterred. "It's not a choice anymore. This is bigger than you or me. If you don't help us, there will be more attacks and innocent people will suffer. Your community will suffer." Claire's mind was spinning. The idea of going back into the world she had left behind terrified her. But deep down she knew these men were right. The violence, the threats, the danger, they wouldn't just go away. And if she refused to act, she might be putting more people at risk. There was a long pause as Claire stood there trying to find a way out of this. She wanted to scream, to tell them all to leave, to forget about her. But something inside her, the part of her that had always been a soldier, told her that she couldn't walk away. Not this time. "If I agree to help you," Claire said slowly, her voice filled with resolve, "what happens then?" The second man nodded. "We'll provide you with everything you need. Training, resources, and intelligence. You'll be working with us to dismantle this network. But you'll need to move quickly. The clock is ticking." The weight of his words settled on her. Claire's heart sank, but she knew there was no turning back now. She had been pulled back into a world she had left behind, a world she thought she had escaped forever. But her decision was made. The quiet Amish life she had sought was over. It was time to fight once again. Just as she was about to speak, the sound of heavy boots echoed outside. Her breath caught in her throat. The men at the door stiffened, their hands subtly moving toward their weapons. Claire's eyes darted to the window, where she saw shadows moving in the darkness. "Someone's coming," she whispered, her voice cold and steady. The two men exchanged a glance, and without a word, they rushed to the door, preparing for what was about to come. The attack was imminent. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the shadows grow closer to her house. The two men at the door didn't flinch, but Claire could sense the tension in the air. She moved quietly to the side, her body instinctively slipping into the training she had tried so hard to leave behind. She was no longer just an Amish woman. She was a Navy SEAL once again, swift, silent, and prepared for anything. The two men stood near the door, their eyes fixed on the approaching threat. Claire knew she had to act quickly, or they would all be in danger. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was ready for this. She wasn't the same frightened woman who had opened the door to them moments ago. She had been in worse situations before. The knock came sharp and demanding. The second man looked at Claire, a silent message in his eyes. It was time. The first man stepped toward the door, his movements deliberate and measured. Claire stood still, watching him carefully, her body tense. When the door opened, 2 more men stood in front of them. Their faces were masked, but the aura of violence they exuded was unmistakable. One of the masked men was holding a gun, pointing it directly at the man who had spoken earlier. The other was scanning the room, his eyes lingering on Claire for a moment before turning away. "We know you're here," the first masked man said, his voice harsh like gravel grinding in his throat. "And we know what you've been planning. You won't get away with it." The 2 men from earlier didn't react. Claire could see the subtle shift in their stance, the way they prepared themselves for a confrontation. They were used to danger, but so was Claire. Her fingers twitched, itching to do something, anything, but she held back. She needed to wait for the right moment. "You've made a mistake," the second man from her house finally said, his voice calm despite the tense situation. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The masked man with the gun laughed, the sound menacing. "We know exactly who we're dealing with. And we're here to make sure you never cause any more trouble. You think you can stop us? You think you can stop what's coming?" Claire's eyes narrowed. The man's words made her skin crawl. Something about this felt personal, more than just a threat against her and the people she cared about. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger. But she didn't have time to think about it now. The door was still open and the men were closing in. "I won't warn you again," the masked man said, his finger hovering over the trigger. "This is your last chance." Before anyone could react, Claire made her move. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the nearest object she could reach, an old wooden chair from the corner of the room. With a swift kick, she sent it crashing into the masked man's chest. He stumbled back in surprise, and Claire immediately lunged forward, using the momentum to her advantage. She grabbed the gun out of his hand, twisting his wrist until he dropped it. She kicked it away before he could recover. The other masked man lunged at her, but Claire was faster. She pivoted, using his own force against him as she swept his legs out from under him. He hit the floor with a thud, but he didn't stay down for long. He scrambled to his feet, pulling out a knife. But Claire was already in motion again. She spun, her Navy SEAL instincts taking over. She grabbed the nearest piece of furniture, a heavy wooden table, and swung it at him with all her strength. The table hit him square in the chest, knocking the air out of him and sending him crashing to the floor. The first masked man, who had recovered from the chair attack, was now rushing toward her. But he was too late. The second man from her house had already grabbed him, twisting his arm behind his back in a way that made the man scream out in pain. "Get down!" the first man from the house shouted at Claire. She ducked just in time as the man sent a punch flying toward her. She grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to his knees. The room was silent for a moment, save for the ragged breathing of the 2 masked men. Claire stood, panting, her body still on high alert. She glanced at the 2 men from her house, who were now securing the masked intruders with handcuffs. "What's going on here?" Claire demanded, her voice sharp. "Who are these men?" The first man from her house looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "These are the people we're up against, Claire. They're part of a larger network, dangerous, ruthless. They don't just attack random targets. They know who you are and they're here for you." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Why me? Why now?" The second man stepped forward, his expression grim. "Because you're the one who can stop them. They know what you've done, what you're capable of. You're a threat to their plans." Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had hoped that her past was buried, that she could live out her life in peace. But that was never going to happen. The violence, the danger, it was following her no matter how far she ran. She turned away, pacing the room as she tried to process everything. What do they want with me? Why are they targeting Amish communities? The first man didn't answer right away. He looked at the 2 men they had subdued, then back at Claire. They believe the Amish way of life holds something valuable. They want to take control of it. You're standing in their way. Claire's mind was racing. She had always known that danger could come at any moment, but this was more than she had anticipated. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her community, and for her past. Suddenly, the sound of more footsteps broke her out of her thoughts. More men were coming and they were ready for a fight. Claire turned to face the 2 men from her house, her eyes hardening with determination. "We need to act fast. We can't let them get away with this." But as the door creaked open, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even worse. The door creaked open and Claire's pulse quickened. She hadn't heard any cars pull up, and the men who had attacked her house were already subdued. This new threat, whoever it was, had been moving silently, staying under the radar. Claire's body tensed, her instincts sharp. She motioned for the two men to stay quiet as she slowly inched toward the door, careful not to make a sound. The footsteps grew louder. Claire could hear the unmistakable shuffle of boots on dirt, the soft whisper of breath through the shadows. These weren't just random attackers, they were organized, trained. Claire knew that better than anyone. With a swift motion, she ducked behind a nearby table and signaled the others to do the same. The two men from her house were now crouched low, their eyes fixed on the door, ready to strike at a moment's notice. The footsteps paused just outside, and for a long, agonizing moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for whatever was coming next. The door swung open violently and a tall figure stepped inside. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him instantly. It was the man from the night before, the one who had warned her of the danger. But this time he wasn't alone. Two others stood behind him, their faces covered by masks, their bodies bristling with weapons. They were here for one reason, to finish what they had started. "Stay down," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mind was racing, calculating her next move. The air was thick with tension, but she couldn't let fear control her. The man who had spoken earlier, the one Claire had fought in her home, stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think you can escape your past? Think again, Claire. We've been waiting for you." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew who he was, but she didn't expect him to come back so quickly. She thought she had a few more hours, maybe even days before things escalated. But now it was all happening at once. The threat she had tried to avoid had come straight to her doorstep. The two masked men didn't wait for Claire to react. They moved toward her in quick, fluid motions, their hands reaching for their weapons. Claire wasn't about to let them take control. She pushed herself to her feet, her Navy SEAL training kicking in. She grabbed the nearest object, a chair, and swung it hard toward the man closest to her. He stumbled back, momentarily stunned. The second man lunged, but Claire was faster. She sidestepped, kicking him in the chest and sending him crashing into a nearby bookshelf. Books and papers flew everywhere as he hit the ground, groaning in pain. The leader of the group, the one who had warned her earlier, watched with an expression of amusement. He didn't seem fazed by Claire's speed or strength. In fact, he looked almost pleased. "Impressive," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But it's not going to save you." Claire's heart raced, but she kept her focus. The man's words didn't faze her. What mattered now was survival. She couldn't let them get the upper hand again. Not after everything she'd been through. She moved toward the door, keeping low to the ground, her eyes scanning the room for any advantage. The two men were recovering from her surprise attack, but they were quick. She had to be quicker. Suddenly, the man from the night before stepped forward, blocking her exit. "You can't hide, Claire. You're a threat to everything we've built." Claire's eyes narrowed, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. "I'm not hiding. I'm fighting back." The man chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You think you can fight against us? We have power. You're nothing more than a pawn." Claire's gaze locked with his, her expression determined. "I'm not a pawn. And I'm not afraid of you." With a swift movement, she lunged forward, catching him off guard. Her fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. He cursed under his breath, but Claire didn't give him time to recover. She grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to the ground. The sound of more footsteps approaching broke her concentration. Claire's eyes flicked toward the window, where she saw shadows moving in the distance. Reinforcements. More of them. And they were closing in fast. The man beneath her struggled, but Claire tightened her grip. "You're not getting away this time," she growled, her voice low and steady. But just as she was about to finish him off, the sound of a car engine revving to life cut through the tension. Claire's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. The sound was unmistakable, it was the sound of a getaway car. "Don't let them escape," Claire shouted to the two men from her house. Without hesitation they rushed to the door, guns drawn, ready for whatever was coming. But it was too late. The car had already sped off into the night, leaving nothing behind but the dust on the road. Claire stood, panting heavily, trying to steady herself. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. These men were after her, and they weren't going to stop. The man she had been fighting managed to get to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. He smirked, his eyes filled with spite. You think you've won, Claire? This is just the beginning. You've made a powerful enemy. Claire met his gaze, her fists clenched. Then I'll be ready. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air was thick with tension as Claire stood over the man she had just subdued, her breath coming in heavy gasps. The adrenaline from the fight still surged through her veins, but she could feel it beginning to fade. The weight of the situation was settling in. The attack on her home, the threat from the man, this was only the beginning. She could feel the storm approaching and it was impossible to outrun it. The two men from her house stood by the door, their eyes scanning the street outside. The sound of the getaway car still echoed in their ears. Claire had heard the car speeding off into the distance, disappearing into the night. It had been a close call. But the fact that they had gotten away meant that the danger was far from over. The man she had taken down was now on his knees, his hands raised in surrender. He looked up at her, his face twisted in anger but also something else, something darker, something far more dangerous. You think you've won, Claire? He spat, blood dripping from his lip. This is just the start. You've made a powerful enemy, one who won't stop until you're dead. Claire took a step back, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't intimidated. She had dealt with far worse in her past. But she knew this was different. This wasn't some random attack. This was personal. They had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The two men from her house stepped forward, pulling the man to his feet and cuffing him tightly. One of them turned to Claire, his face serious. We need to move fast. If they got away, there's no telling what they'll do next. We don't have much time. Claire nodded, her mind already working. She had to stay ahead of them. There was no other option. She couldn't let her past, or these men, control her life any longer. She had already lost so much. She wasn't about to lose more. We need to find out who they're working for, Claire said, her voice low and determined. We need to know who's behind this. The second man nodded. We'll get you the intel. But you have to be ready. They'll be back. Claire turned toward the window, looking out into the dark streets. The threat wasn't just hanging over her anymore. It was here. And it wasn't going away. She had a choice to make. She could continue hiding, continue pretending that her past didn't exist. Or she could fight back, face the danger head-on, and protect the people she loved. She knew what she had to do. But the question remained, was she ready for what was coming? The next day Claire didn't sleep. She couldn't. The images of the masked men, their threat hanging in the air, replayed over and over in her mind. She tried to focus on her daily chores, to push everything aside and live the peaceful life she had worked so hard to build. But the truth was she couldn't escape it. The past had caught up with her and there was no hiding anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She moved cautiously to the door, looking through the peephole. To her surprise, it was the man who had arrived the night before, the one who had warned her, the one who seemed to know everything about her past. His eyes were shadowed with concern, and his posture was tense. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice low. It's important. Claire opened the door slowly, her instincts on high alert. The man stepped inside, looking around as though he were checking for anyone who might be watching. When he was satisfied, he turned to face her. Things are worse than I thought, he said, his voice urgent. The group we're up against, they have connections. People in high places. And they know who you are. They've been tracking your every move. Claire's stomach twisted. She had feared this. The idea that these men had been watching her, that they had known about her life as a Navy SEAL, was enough to make her feel vulnerable in a way she hadn't in years. She had always prided herself on being able to stay hidden, stay out of the limelight. But it seemed there was no escaping her past. They're not just after you, the man continued. They're after everything you've built. Your community. Your family. And if you don't stop them now, they'll tear it all apart. Claire's jaw tightened. This was no longer just about her. This was about everyone she cared about. The peaceful life she had sought to build, the life she had worked so hard to protect, was at risk. I can't let that happen, Claire said firmly. I'll do whatever it takes to stop them. The man nodded. We've already got a lead. There's a meeting tomorrow night, at a warehouse on the outskirts of town. We believe that's where they're operating from. But we'll need your help to get inside. Claire's heart raced. The prospect of going back into that world, of getting involved in something so dangerous, filled her with dread. But there was no turning back. The fight had already come to her doorstep. She was in this now whether she liked it or not. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The man nodded again, a grim look on his face. Good. Because tomorrow night, everything changes. The door closed behind him and Claire stood in the dim light of her home, her mind racing with possibilities. What would she find at the warehouse? Who would she have to face? The questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be easy. Tomorrow night they would make their move. And Claire would be ready. The night was colder than usual as Claire stood in the shadows outside the warehouse. The sounds of the town were distant, muffled by the thick walls of the building. She stood with her back against a brick wall, her eyes scanning the area. The man from earlier had arranged everything. They knew that tonight was the night to confront the group that had been tormenting her, and now she had to make sure they succeeded. Her nerves were on edge, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford any distractions. Not tonight. Every step they took had to be calculated. She had spent too many years trying to forget this life, and now here she was, about to face the enemy she had been trying to outrun. The two men from her house stood next to her, their expressions grim as they prepared for the worst. Their weapons were ready and they had a plan. They would infiltrate the warehouse, gather intel on the group's operation, and put an end to this once and for all. "Everything's set," the first man said, his voice low and steady. "We go in quietly, get the information we need and get out. No risks." Claire nodded, her hands tightening around the grip of her gun. She wasn't used to taking orders, but she knew this was bigger than her. This was about stopping the violence before it spread any further. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about protecting her family, her community, and anyone else who might be in danger. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and the three of them slipped inside, blending into the shadows. The air inside was damp and smelled of oil and dust. Their footsteps echoed through the cavernous space as they moved cautiously, each step measured. Claire's heart beat faster as they made their way through the building. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The mission was simple, but the stakes were high. If they made one wrong move, everything could go wrong. They reached the center of the warehouse, where a small group of men were gathered around a table, speaking in low voices. Claire couldn't make out what they were saying, but she knew this was it. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The man from her house motioned for them to stay back. He moved silently toward the men, his eyes fixed on the group. Claire stayed in the shadows, her breathing steady as she waited for the signal. She had to stay focused. She couldn't let her emotions get in the way now. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor broke the silence, and Claire tensed. The man at the table had stood up, and for a brief moment their eyes met. Claire's heart stopped as she realized who it was. It was the leader of the group, the man who had threatened her, the one who had been following her every move. His eyes were cold and calculating, and he wasn't alone. There were more of them, hidden in the corners of the warehouse, watching every move they made. "This isn't over, Claire," the man said, his voice carrying across the room. "You've made a grave mistake by coming here." Before Claire could react, the warehouse doors slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The only sounds were the heavy breathing of the group and the soft shuffle of footsteps. Claire's pulse quickened. The ambush had been set. The first man cursed under his breath, and they quickly moved to the back of the warehouse, searching for an exit. But the building was surrounded and there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. Claire's mind raced. This was the moment she had feared. They had walked right into a trap, and now they had no choice but to fight their way out. "We need to get out of here. Now," Claire said, her voice low but filled with urgency. "We're not leaving empty-handed. We're taking them down." The first man nodded, his face tight with resolve. "On your lead, Claire." But before they could make a move, the leader's voice rang out again. "You've already lost," he said, his words cold and final. "You can't fight what's coming. You should have stayed hidden. Now you'll see what happens when you don't listen." The tension in the air was thick, and Claire could feel the weight of the words settling on her shoulders. She had known the consequences, but the reality was harder to face than she had imagined. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everything she had left. And that made her more dangerous than ever. "Get ready," Claire said, her eyes scanning the room. "It's not over yet." Without another word, she charged forward, her gun raised, her instincts guiding her every move. The fight was about to begin, and there was no turning back. The first shot rang out, breaking the silence. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as the chaos erupted around her. Men lunged from every direction, their weapons drawn, but Claire was faster. She moved like a shadow, dodging bullets, disarming attackers and taking them down one by one. She felt the rush of adrenaline as she fought. This was who she was. This was the woman she had been before. And now she had to embrace it because there was no running from the storm. The past had caught up with her, and it was time to face it head-on. The second man from her house was beside her, covering her back as they fought their way through the warehouse. The leader of the group was nowhere to be seen, but Claire knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. The warehouse was a war zone, and Claire was in the middle of it. There was no telling how many men were waiting for them in the shadows, but she was ready. She had to be. For herself. For her community. For everyone who had been caught in this fight. As the last man fell to the ground, Claire's breath came in ragged gasps. She stood in the center of the warehouse, her gun still raised, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. "Where is he?" she muttered under her breath, searching the shadows. But then, a movement in the corner of her eye caught her attention. The leader. He was there, watching from above, a smug smile playing on his lips. "You'll never win, Claire," he called down to her, his voice filled with malice. "You've made a mistake. This is far from over." Claire's blood ran cold as she realized what he was saying. He was right. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Claire's heart raced as she stared up at the leader standing above her, his figure illuminated by the dim light coming from the flickering warehouse bulbs. His eyes gleamed with cold satisfaction, as if he knew exactly how the battle would end. His words cut through the noise of the warehouse, a grim reminder that this was far from over. "You think you've won, Claire?" he sneered. "This is only the beginning. You can't stop what's coming. You're too small, too insignificant. You're out of your depth." The weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. The fight had been long and brutal, but she had expected this. She had always known that the road ahead would be difficult, that she couldn't face these enemies alone. But now, with the leader so close, Claire realized just how far she had fallen into his trap. She tightened her grip on her gun, her fingers burning with the tension of the fight. She couldn't afford to lose focus now. Not when so much was on the line. The two men from her house moved swiftly to her side, weapons drawn, ready to back her up. But Claire knew that even together they couldn't take on the entire network. They needed more. They needed intelligence, they needed strategy. They needed to be one step ahead. "Get down," one of the men shouted as the leader pulled out a gun, aiming it directly at Claire. The bullet whizzed past her, narrowly missing as she dove to the side. In that split second, Claire's mind raced. The man above had already planned his next move. The men who had been fighting alongside her were still recovering from the ambush. It was too risky to continue this fight in the open, and Claire knew they needed to regroup. "Fall back," Claire shouted, her voice ringing with authority. She didn't have time to explain, to give orders. She knew the others would follow her, but they had to get out of the warehouse and fast. They moved as one, darting for cover as gunfire rang out. Claire led the way, her steps quick and precise. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This was personal. They knew who she was. And now they would stop at nothing to finish what they had started. As they sprinted toward the rear of the warehouse, Claire's mind flashed back to everything she had left behind when she had walked away from the military. She had hoped that starting over, living a quiet life, would bring peace. But peace was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not anymore. They reached the back door, but before they could make it outside, the sound of footsteps grew louder. A group of men, cloaked in shadow, emerged from the dark corners of the warehouse, cutting off their escape. Claire's blood ran cold as she counted the number of attackers. There were too many. "We're surrounded," one of the men from her house said, his voice tight with urgency. Claire's mind raced. They couldn't fight their way out of this. They had no choice but to face the leader head-on. But she knew that every second mattered. If they didn't act quickly, they would be trapped for good. "You go first," Claire ordered, her eyes scanning the room for an exit. "I'll cover you." Without waiting for a response, Claire sprinted toward the group of attackers, using the cover of the warehouse crates to her advantage. She dove behind a pile of boxes, her gun raised, ready to fight. The men closed in, but Claire was already one step ahead, her training taking over as she dispatched each attacker with precision and skill. The leader's voice rang out again, taunting, mocking her as she fought. "You really think you can stop me? I'll make sure your community pays the price for this." His words struck a nerve, but Claire didn't let them distract her. She couldn't afford to get emotional now. She had to keep her focus no matter what. With a final burst of energy, Claire leapt into the fray, taking down the last of the attackers with a swift move. She landed on her feet, out of breath, but victorious. For now. But as she looked around, she realized they weren't out of the woods yet. The leader was still somewhere in the warehouse, watching, waiting. He had underestimated her before, and now she was going to make him pay for it. She signaled for the others to stay low, and together they moved toward the back of the warehouse. They needed to find the leader before he could regroup or call in reinforcements. "Where is he?" Claire muttered under her breath. "Where is the bastard hiding?" The sound of a door creaking open echoed through the building, and Claire's eyes shot to the source. The leader emerged from the shadows, his gun still raised, his expression filled with rage. "I'll make you regret ever crossing me, Claire," he snarled, his finger twitching on the trigger. "You can't stop me. You've lost." But Claire wasn't afraid. She stood her ground, her gun aimed directly at him. This time she wouldn't back down. "I'm not done yet," Claire said, her voice steady and unwavering. With one swift motion she fired. The leader collapsed to the ground, his body crumpling in a heap as the sound of the shot echoed through the warehouse. For a moment the room was still. Claire's breath came in short bursts as she took in what had just happened. She had taken down the leader, but she knew this wasn't the end of the war. This was just one battle in a much larger fight. "We need to move," Claire said, her voice hard with determination. "There are still others out there. This isn't over." The two men nodded, their expressions filled with the same resolve. They had won this fight, but they had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. As they exited the warehouse, Claire felt the weight of what they had just done. The night wasn't over, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear: Claire wasn't going down without a fight. The cold wind bit through Claire's jacket as they emerged from the warehouse, the moon casting an eerie light over the deserted street. The chaos inside the building still hung in the air, the sounds of the fight echoing in her mind. But despite the temporary victory, Claire knew this wasn't the end. The leader's body may have fallen, but the network that he represented was still out there. And they were far from finished. "We need to get somewhere safe," Claire said, her voice grim. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. "They'll come looking for us. And when they do, we won't have much time." The two men from her house nodded in agreement, their eyes sharp as they scanned the area. Claire wasn't sure where they should go next. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. The only thing she knew for sure was that they couldn't stay in one place for long. As they moved through the darkened streets, Claire's mind raced. What had the leader meant when he said this was just the beginning? The attack on her home, the ambush at the warehouse. It was clear that they had been targets for a much larger operation. The question was, who was pulling the strings? "We need to find out who's behind all of this," Claire said, her voice steady. "We need intel. If we're going to stop them, we need to know what we're up against." The second man from her house glanced at her. "We'll find out. But we need to stay out of sight. The more we expose ourselves, the more danger we're in." Claire nodded. She understood the risks, but the thought of the danger still looming over her community kept her awake at night. She had already made the decision to fight back, to protect the people she cared about. But as they moved through the quiet streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching to a halt broke the silence. Claire's body went rigid, her eyes darting to the side as a black SUV pulled up next to them. The doors opened and 4 men stepped out. They were dressed in black, their faces concealed by masks. It didn't take a genius to figure out that these men weren't here for a friendly chat. "Get down," Claire shouted, her instincts kicking in as she dropped to the ground, pulling the 2 men with her. Bullets tore through the air, the sound of gunfire sharp and immediate. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she dove behind a nearby dumpster, the others following her quickly. "We're surrounded," one of the men muttered, his voice tight with fear. "What now?" Claire's mind raced as she assessed the situation. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and in the open. But they weren't going down without a fight. "Not now." "We fight," Claire said, her voice low and steady. "We don't have a choice." The next few minutes were a blur of movement and gunfire. Claire's body was alive with adrenaline as she fired back at the attackers, her shots precise and focused. The 2 men from her house were covering her, their weapons firing in tandem with hers. They were a well-oiled machine, working in sync to take down their assailants. But the men kept coming, their movements calculated and cold. They were relentless. "Fall back," Claire shouted as she saw more figures emerging from the shadows. It was clear now that they had walked into another trap. "We need to get to cover now." They turned and ran, ducking behind buildings, using every bit of cover they could find. Claire's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder, trying to keep track of the attackers. They were gaining ground and there wasn't much time left. "We need to get to the safe house," one of the men from her house said, his voice strained. "It's the only place we can regroup." Claire nodded. It was their best option, but getting there wouldn't be easy. They had to stay ahead of the men chasing them. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. As they sprinted through the streets, Claire's thoughts raced. Who were these men? How had they tracked them down so quickly? Were they connected to the network that had been targeting her, or were they something else entirely? The answers weren't clear, but Claire knew one thing for sure. They were running out of time. They reached the safe house after what felt like an eternity, their bodies aching from the sprint. Claire slammed the door behind them and locked it, her chest heaving as she took in deep breaths. She glanced around, checking for any signs of pursuit. "We're safe for now," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. But this isn't over. The two men from her house were already checking the windows, making sure no one had followed them inside. Claire's mind was still racing. There were too many unanswered questions. Who was behind the attacks? What did they want? And most importantly, why had they been targeted in the first place? "We need to find out who's pulling the strings," Claire said, her eyes hard with resolve. "We can't afford to wait any longer. We need to stop them before they can strike again." The man from her house nodded. "We'll get the intel. But we need to be careful. These people are everywhere." Claire's jaw clenched as she glanced out the window. The streets were quiet now, but she knew better than to think that meant they were safe. There was a storm coming, and she wasn't going to let it take everything from her. "We'll be ready," Claire said. "I won't let them win. Not this time." The morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of the safe house, casting long shadows across the floor. Claire sat at the small table in the corner, her mind still racing from the night's chaos. The adrenaline had worn off, but the tension in her body was still palpable. The group that had been hunting her was far more organized and dangerous than she had ever anticipated. They weren't just some random thugs, they were part of something much bigger. And now they were closing in on her. The two men from her house were quiet, their expressions grim as they worked on gathering intel. The information they had recovered from the warehouse was useful, but it didn't give them everything they needed. They were still in the dark about the true extent of the organization they were up against. Claire clenched her fists, trying to control the rising panic in her chest. She had been running for so long, always staying one step ahead, always hiding in the shadows. But now she couldn't keep running anymore. The fight was here and it was time to face it head on. "We need to strike back," Claire said, her voice hard with determination. "We can't wait for them to come to us. We need to find their headquarters, get inside and take them down." The man from her house looked at her with concern. "It's too risky. We don't know where they're operating from, and they've already shown they're willing to kill anyone who stands in their way. We need more information before we make a move." Claire shook her head, her eyes steely with resolve. "We don't have time. If we don't act now, they'll come after us again. And next time they won't miss." The other man nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. "She's right. The longer we wait, the more people they'll hurt. We can't let that happen." The group was silent for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over them. Claire's pulse quickened as she thought of all the innocent people who were caught in the crossfire, the ones who didn't deserve to be dragged into this war. She had to stop this. She had to end it before it spread any further. "We need to move," Claire said firmly. "We need to get to the city and find out where they're based. We'll gather intel, make our move, and take them out." The two men nodded, the same fierce determination reflected in their eyes. They had come this far. They couldn't turn back now. The drive into the city was tense. Claire kept her focus on the road, her mind still running through the plan. The city was bustling with activity, the sounds of traffic and people creating a stark contrast to the quiet and isolation they had been living in for the past few days. But despite the busy streets, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The enemy was close. And they were closing in fast. They parked a few blocks away from the building they suspected might be the headquarters of the group. It was an unremarkable office building, tucked in between other businesses, but something about it felt off. Claire's instincts screamed at her to be careful. She had been in enough dangerous situations to know that this wasn't just some coincidence. This was their base of operations. "We go in quiet," Claire whispered, her voice low but commanding. "We gather intel and we get out. No mistakes." The two men nodded, their faces set in grim determination. They knew the stakes. They knew the risks. But they also knew that if they didn't act, it would be too late. As they made their way toward the building, Claire's mind raced. She thought about everything they had fought for, the peaceful life she had wanted, the community she had tried to protect. It had all been torn apart, and now the only thing that mattered was stopping the group that had caused this chaos. They reached the door of the building and slipped inside, moving quickly and silently. Claire's senses were on high alert, her eyes darting around the dimly lit hallway as they made their way deeper into the building. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the air seemed thicker with each passing moment. The door to the main office was just ahead. Claire signaled for the men to stay close, and they moved toward it, their footsteps barely making a sound. When they reached the door, Claire slowly turned the handle and pushed it open, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The office was empty, but the desks were cluttered with papers and files. Claire's eyes flicked over the documents, searching for anything that could give them the information they needed. She moved toward a desk in the far corner where a laptop sat open, its screen flashing with a list of names and addresses. "This is it," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what we need." The man from her house moved quickly to the laptop, pulling the screen closer and scanning the list. "These are the people behind the operation," he muttered, his eyes widening as he read through the names. "We've got a list of their key players." Claire's mind raced as she read the names over his shoulder. These weren't just criminals. These were people with power, people in positions of influence. This was much bigger than she had imagined. But before she could take another step, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Claire's heart skipped a beat. They had been found. "Move!" Claire hissed, her voice low and urgent. "We need to get out of here. Now." They rushed for the door, but as they stepped into the hallway, they found themselves face to face with a group of armed men. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot.